Hi everyone, welcome to the Hilton Forrester Show. I've got a great guest of mine, Keith Pearlman. We go back many years, and Keith is a partner at DMH Stallard. He specializes in commercial property issues. Just introduce yourself, Keith.
Hi, Hilton. Yes, I'm a partner at DMH Stallard Solicitors. We are a firm that has 5 offices, of which I'm very firmly based in central London, in New Fetter Lane. And I am a property litigator, I suppose, dealing with commercial property issues affecting commercial landlords, commercial tenants, and that can involve insolvency as well, which I deal with.
Okay.
So that's pretty much the gambit, the overall description of what I get involved in on a day-to-day basis.
Great, brilliant. And just to reiterate, you're not giving advice, you're giving just the guidance of how you see the market at the moment.
Yeah, it's just my take on what I'm my take on current on the current market, given my own experiences, past experiences, and in light of what's going on at the moment. But
Brilliant.
no, not formal advice. But that's where someone would have to seek their own, speak to their own solicitors, or to contact me directly. But very happy to give my thoughts for what they're
Great.
worth.
Oh, I'm happy to have you here. My first question then, what impact has COVID had on the commercial property market, Keith?
Oh, that's a goodie. That's a goodie, Hilton.
Right.
Very, very, very huge. It had a huge impact on commercial property. I mean, let me put this into context. I deal with and have always dealt with property issues, which are very much, I always say, market led. In good times, the
Yeah.
landlords are in a strong position and tenants are in a weaker position. That's often reflected in the rents that a commercial tenant may have to pay. When the market's good, he has to pay a high rent. It has to pay a high rent. When the market's bad, it can take a property at a lower rent because the landlords want to ensure that their properties are occupied for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
So if you think back, we had all the issues with Brexit and the uncertainty there. We then had a period of relative stagnation in property from 2016-ish onwards.
Yeah.
Then we finally get over the Brexit issue. Well, we finally get to the point where after the election last year, we get a period of stability in what looked to be on an upwardly mobile economic plane.
Okay.
And then boom, we have COVID. And that's taken the stuffing out of not just the property market, it's taken the stuffing out of the market generally all over the world.
Yes.
But if you think specifically in terms of commercial property, think about it. You've got tenants who haven't or may not have paid their rent for what is coming up to a year. Most commercial tenants pay rent on a quarterly basis.
Yeah.
So they pay in March, June, September, and December. Since the 31st of March last year, the government have introduced restrictions, which mean that a landlord can't do what it would normally do when a tenant doesn't pay its rent. What's that? The ultimate sanction for a landlord
Yeah.
who doesn't pay rent is to forfeit the lease. That means take the lease back.
Okay. Okay.
And you have to think, well, why would they do that? That's another issue. But that sanction isn't available to a landlord right now. So that means that tenants, commercial tenants, either haven't paid their rent for a considerable time, or, and I'll come on to it, even if they've created or entered into some form of arrangement with their landlords. On a positive note, they may have had a rent waiver or
Yeah.
they've had a rent deferral. But either way, on where rent hasn't been paid or it's been deferred, you've got a build-up of debt there that has to be repaid at some time or other. So when those government restrictions come to an end, and at the moment they're due to end on the 31st of March this year,
Yeah.
and remember they've been extended on 1, 2, 3 occasions now. This will be the 4th occasion if it's extended beyond that. And although the government has said it doesn't intend to extend further, let's wait and see. Because, as long as the pandemic is as rife as it is, even with vaccines and everything else, it's going to take a long time before the market comes back.
Right, right,
It's
okay.
quite possible, my own opinion, that it could get extended further. So when you say to me, what's the impact of COVID on the property market? It's unprecedented. It's as big as I've ever seen. I've never seen anything like this. I've seen various recessions, obvious crash in 2008, and I go back beyond that. But this is like nothing else we've seen.
Wow, okay. I do remember 2008 as well, yeah, the changes there. But it's
I was going to say you
incredible.
look far too young, Hilton, but I take that back.
Well, okay, well, thanks for that, Keith. I'll pay you the
I
money
didn't mean
later.
it. I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it.
Okay, but when you mentioned about landlords, what options do landlords have to protect themselves? I speak with a lot of landlords and people in property, and there's an uncertainty there. How can you advise that?
Well, I think you've got to again. I think you've got to look at what you can do, what you want to do, and what you need to do. I
Okay.
mean, as I say, the can dos are limited because for the reasons I've just given you, the landlords can't forfeit a lease. Now, one of the other things that one would normally do in a normal quote market would be if a commercial tenant hasn't paid and the landlord doesn't necessarily want to take the lease back, and there are lots of reasons for that, because obviously if there's an income stream coming in, you don't want to cut off that stream. But
Yeah.
at the same token, if you've got your tenant in occupation in your premises and they're trading, you want to get your rent. Now, in normal circumstances, in addition to forfeiture, or as an alternative to forfeiting a lease, which they
Yeah.
can't do at the moment,
Yes.
you might threaten to wind up the company if it's a corporate tenant. Or
Okay.
you may serve a statutory demand, both of which are part of an insolvency process. So if it's a company, you don't need to serve a statutory demand, you don't have to.
Yeah.
You could proceed to wind them up. If it's an individual, you could serve a statutory demand, which you have to, which is a 21-day demand for the payment of rent. I mean, it's individual, excuse me, then you would issue a bankruptcy petition, or as the company, you issue a winding up petition.
Right.
Again,
Right.
those options aren't available right now for the same reason that you can't forfeit, because you've got the government restrictions in place to stop you doing it. And similarly, you can't send in the bailiffs in the same way that one would do to distrain, in other words, take goods to the value of.
Yes.
So going back in my long-winded way to your very short question, what options are they available? What options are there available to a landlord? They're limited. You can still issue proceedings,
Yes.
in relation to a money claim. So if you've got a tenant that owes a landlord £100,000 worth of rent over a year, which isn't, right, that's not terrible. That's just, £100,000 worth of rent they've not paid since March. What can they do? They could issue a claim for a pure monetary claim to
Okay.
seek a judgment on
Yes.
that rent. How they enforce it is another matter. But by issuing proceedings, it may, especially with some of the bigger PLCs, it may just force the tenant into being pressured sufficiently to pay that money. Another alternative, for example, may be drawing down on a rent deposit.
Yes.
Often you may have a landlord, depending on the market, may have taken a substantial rent deposit, which generally can be 1 or 2 quarters rent.
Okay.
So you
Okay.
so you may want to draw down on the rent deposit. Not always the best option, because there may be other breaches later on. For example, dilapidations at the end of the term, which we'll come on to in another time. And you may want to keep that deposit as security for other breaches along
Yes.
the way. You
Yes.
don't have to draw down on it. But these are difficult times. We've got landlords who've got to service their own commitments to their lenders where there aren't restrictions in place.
Yes.
So in certain situations, the landlord may want to draw down on, on a rent deposit, simply to give them that sort of cash flow scenario.
Yes.
But as I say, um, the options are limited. There are, And there is, shall I say, a voluntary code of conduct that exists, the government have introduced rather, where in very, very broad terms, landlords and tenants are meant to, quote, talk to each other with a view to trying to reach some form of compromise
Yes.
in the current climate, to avoid litigation later on, to assist each other in this difficult time. And I have to say, I mean, I won't go through the code of conduct in detail. It is voluntary, so you're not compelled to comply with it.
Yeah.
Although there are some suggestion that if you ignore it completely, you could end up being adversely affected with regard to costs if litigation were to take place later on. But what I'm trying to say is, in the code of conduct, they talk about things like agreeing a rent deferral or a rent waiver, which I mentioned earlier, or paying or trying to accommodate each other by, for example, agreeing to monthly payments of rent.
Yes.
So things that deal with parties cooperating with each other. Now, it's all very, very nice to talk about. And I have to say, across my desk at the moment, there are lots of those discussions going on between commercial landlords and tenants. And even as a litigator, I know it sounds perverse, I'm really pleased to see parties talking to each other. Those arrangements do need to be put in writing. They do need to be dealt with properly, because it could amount to a variation of the lease terms, which you have to be very careful about, particularly if there are guarantors in place. But those are things that one should look at and take on board. And finally, just sorry to wrap up on that, and I know I'm talking too much. One of the other, I mentioned guarantors because often in commercial leases you will see a guarantor on the lease.
Yes.
And you may want to, where a tenant hasn't paid rent, and because it's not trading, or it hasn't got sufficient cash flow, or it's pleading poverty based on COVID issues, which are very real, obviously, in many situations, not all, but many.
Yeah.
If there's a guarantor in place, that's another method by which you can try and go through the back door, if you like, to try and recover the rent arrears, because you can attack a guarantor for money that's due and owing, or any breaches of covenant that your tenant has committed through the term. So
Awesome. That's
options.
beautiful. Yeah, it's great what you're saying. You focus on what you can do, focus on what you want to do, and also the what you need to do. Those three areas is really important. And I would add to that, because there's someone I'm coaching who's in property, and I think the impact of all this uncertainty, what it has on your mental state, is very important as well, because people can go through difficult times mentally, and worrying about, if they're not getting their rent paid on time, what's going to happen next.
I think that you raise a really good point. I think that, I mean, putting aside all the law and everything else, I mean, the impact from a mental point of view on both landlords and tenants in particular is enormous.
Yeah.
And shouldn't be underestimated. I mean, it's my job. I have to deal with issues, but I'm used to dealing with that sort of pressure. But I'm in my ivory tower looking down and dealing with these issues from a desk. If I was trading in premises where I couldn't trade because I'm not allowed to, which means I haven't got an income. I've got the buildup of debt, as I mentioned earlier. The mental pressure that causes me and my family is huge. In the same way as a commercial landlord not receiving the rent.
Yes.
And they've still got various lots of exposure to other issues here. So yeah, huge issue.
Yeah, mental state. I always believe focus on what you can control, and in certain areas. And what trends do you see as when you mention your desk? What, for instance, 2 years ago, what was passing along your desk to now? Is there a big difference? I know it's a very difficult time, but what trend are you seeing?
Um, I think that I think that taking a step back, obviously the areas that have been most affected the retail sector.
Yeah.
I think, so we're talking about, in particular, hospitality. So we're talking about restaurants, travel industry, um, all these areas. I think retail is probably the best example, if you like, of how badly the market, so COVID has affected what's going on. I think that I think that a lot of people, I think that one of the other issues, of course, it's raised is in terms of the office market. I work in an office, and I never, ever thought I hated the idea of working at home. And here I am, 9 months on, surrounded by screens.
Yes.
And actually, I kind of got used to it, and I miss human contact, obviously. And I dare say that we're going to reach this hybrid situation when we all go back on a part-time basis. In other words, we're probably not going to go back to working 5 days a week in the office. Why would you, when you've got the commute and all that entails, the cost, everything else, when you can do what you do very well from your desk? So I think we're going to see a situation where the office market will change.
Yeah.
So if you're saying to me, how have things changed? I think, as I say, I'm slightly confused by the question. Are we talking about future trends? Are we talking about things affected by COVID
I
now?
think on your desk, you're actually seeing a lot of changes, people coming through with different issues, and there will be more than likely
Okay.
a repeating.
Yeah. Okay.
What are you seeing there?
Okay. Well, I think the obvious one in that context is an increasing number of people looking to get out of their leases. Now,
Yeah.
that's not an easy thing to do.
Wow.
If you're fortunate enough to have a break clause in your lease, and you can exercise a break clause, which means bringing the lease to an end earlier than the term of the lease, that's, for a lot of people, is a golden nugget in the current market.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
that's very, very important. I think that um, other tenants who haven't got that luxury, for example, you may have a lease that runs on for another 5, 10 years, are, if they can afford it, willing to pay a capital sum to a landlord in order to get out of those liabilities.
Okay.
Or they may, as a condition of failing to pay rent or getting a rent waiver for a year, agree to an extension of their lease. In other words, if their lease ends in 2025,
Yes.
the landlord may turn around and say, okay, we'll give you 6 months or a year rent free if you agree to extend your lease by a year.
Yes.
So
Yes.
that gives the landlord the security of knowing they're going to get an extra year's rent, and the
Right.
tenant the comfort of knowing that they don't have to pay rent for this year, or
Okay.
until such
Okay.
time as things start moving again. We're talking about renegotiating lease terms in a way that one would never have thought of doing before. As I said, monthly rents is the obvious thing. Um, um, just looking at ways to try and deal with current crisis, which is obviously bottom line cash flow.
Yeah.
The other area that I'm seeing a lot of, which I do a lot of actually, is dilapidations, which again,
Okay.
I know we'll talk about another time, but
Yes.
that's repairs. And I think that one of the things we're seeing at the moment is that with landlords not receiving rent, a way in which they can put pressure, a way in which they can try and recover money is through putting pressure on a tenant in relation to repairs at the end of a term. Now, again, it's another subject for another day,
Yeah.
but what it does bring into focus is that if you're going to end your lease early, that means that the obligation to put the premises into repair early will now kick in.
Yes.
So most tenants won't have made provision. I say that because that's just the way I see it. A lot of tenants won't have made sufficient provision, or if they have, it's still going to bite them to deal with those issues. So you have to be ready. If you're going to break your lease, you need to be able to deal with those issues. And that's, as I say, a whole separate subject. But
Great.
it's something I'm seeing a lot of at the moment, dealing with a lot of those types of claims.
Awesome. Awesome. So I think going forward, we will do another podcasts generally about certain things like
Sure.
does COVID provide opportunities for commercial tenants, the landlord litigation, maintenance, and provide the differences in what's happening in the lockdown and what you actually see is going to be the changes when we come out of it, because we will be taking quite a while to get back to near normal, so we can expand further on certain areas regarding that. But I think for this one, I think it would be great for you to actually, if you had a vision of the future, and you could look further ahead in, say, 5 years' time. I know the impact of COVID is going to change our lives forever. What would you see the difference now in that time, the future?
I think you're talking about crystal ball gazing,
Oh
right?
yes, yes, absolutely. That's
Crystal
what I
ball
mean.
gazing. Okay, lawyers are, well, I'm rubbish at that. I think it's such a difficult question. It's such a difficult question because, and I've said this before, that I heard it said that the current pandemic has escalated trends that were taking place beforehand by some 5 to 10 years. And I recently made that quote somewhere else, and I heard it in a seminar I was sitting in. And I think it's so true, because if you think about it, before COVID, you have people that were, the working from home scenario, the click and collect, and all those sort of the impact of the high street. And the high street, I've often talked about the demise of the local high street. Now, if you think of that, just focusing on that for a minute, is or does COVID, will it rejuvenate the high street because not so many people will be going and traveling into town? Does that mean that there are going to be more coffee shops in your local uh, shopping, your nearest shopping area
Yes,
to go to, because you're working from home? You want to step out, you want to see people, you're going to have local meetings,
yeah,
etc. So I think the local high street could benefit in a funny, perverse sort of way from COVID. I think they're going to have to deal and address things like business rates, which is still a massive, massive issue for commercial tenants.
okay,
Um, I think that, as I say, I think from the working from home is going to be a big issue, and the impact that's going to have on um, central London. I talk it from the central London point of view. There's a London, I've got cities, I should say, cities.
yes, yes,
I'm so London centric.
yeah,
And I think that you're going to see changes in sort of shopping centres. I mean, I live in North London. The biggest shopping centre near to me is Brent Cross, and that when Brent Cross was built, I always quote this. My late father, came out and said it's going to be a complete white elephant. It's never going to work. And of course, it was a huge, huge success.
yes, yeah,
And those and other shopping centres, Westfield now and all the others. But prior to COVID, a lot of those shopping centres were aging and were struggling. Now, if you think of the impact of COVID on shopping centres, those concepts have got to change. I know
yes,
that
yeah,
they're going to, will they have more residential um, flats and properties built in or as part of? Will there be more leisure facilities? So you've got this one complex that deals with, resi, commercial, retail, etc. Experiences, I suppose that's what the word I was looking for.
yes, yes,
So I do think that there are going to be huge changes. On a sort of more legal level, I think you can see much shorter leases, much more
oh,
flexibility in
okay,
leases,
yeah,
upward only rent reviews. I mean, what's all that about? It's historic. It's archaic.
yes,
Why should rent only ever go up after 3 or 5 years, or whatever the review period is? It's nonsense. It's something we're used to doing, so we accept it as a norm.
yes,
But I think COVID has brought into focus so many issues that were already issues.
yes, yes,
And even the housing secretary has made reference to reform, both in terms of the 1954 Landlord and Tenant Act, which is the act that provides statutory protection for business tenants. And even on the residential side, there's talk about right to buy, failing, no longer having to pay ground rents and all that sort of stuff. So lots and lots of changes. Unfortunately, there's not enough flesh on the bone yet. We don't know what's going to happen other than the fact that there is likely to be change.
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, Hilton. I'm never that great with change. It always takes me a while to get used to change. And some people embrace it really well. I struggle slightly with it.
I totally understand, Keith.
But you know what? We have to. And I think that if nothing else, we've had to adapt, and we all have adapted over the last few months. And I dare say we'll all continue to adapt going forward, health willing. So, that big
Awesome.
Changes are afoot.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Keith. That was wonderful. I think one of what comes to mind for me is adaptation. And generally, you find that in the animal kingdom, Lion in the Jungle, he's got 4 seasons and he's got to adapt to every single season. And I think this is something what we're going through, I think, so.
Yeah, tough times for sure.
Yeah, there are times and I think change is on us all the time and we've just got to adapt to it. So I really thank you for the time today, Keith. And just to reiterate, what we will do, we'll do another 4 talks about what you actually do, so that the listeners can get deeper into it. Is that okay with you?
That's great. Listen, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to be on. It's always good. Lawyers love to talk, and I suppose I'm no exception. So,
awesome.
Thank you, and good to see you.
Okay, thanks very much, and we'll speak soon. Bye.
Bye.